Okay, I think we can start, and we can make this a conversation. We have changed the format, so we went from a traditional webinar to an open format where people can actually interact with us, and let's see how this is going to work. As you remember, we started with the pandemic back in March when we were supposed to organize the big free market roadshow event in Rome in June, but it has to be, of course, canceled, and we decided to go live online with a series of webinars, very interesting webinars, all recorded, all available online on the Free Market Roadshow. And then in June, we decided to start with the Austrian Economics Monthly. And here we are. This is the fourth event that we run every month. We decided to, to be consistent and do it in August as well. And today, we're going to talk about trade. Last time we talked about the universal income, and we had a very tough discussion. But today we're moving back to the hot topic of trade, and we're going to do this with a great panel. And I'm always very proud and very, in a way, happy to have such great speakers. We have Robert Grant, that is Director of International Policy at the U.S. Chamber, Global Innovation Policy Center. We have Daniel Dalton, that is the CEO of the British Chamber of Commerce, EU Belgium, and the former MEP of West Midlands. And we have Calum Nicholson, Correspondent of the Economic Standard, and I'm sure you're based in London right now, and Patrick Rosenstiel, founder and chairman of the Trade Alliance to Promote Prosperity. And I wish we could talk about prosperity today, because with the pandemic, it seems that our prosperity, or at least our attempt to prosper, has dramatically decreased, as well as trade. It's very hard to talk about trade during the pandemic, and probably a lot of the rules have changed during the pandemic. And in one of my university course, students are asking me, how is trade working during the pandemic, and how has changed for companies, particularly companies that have a global supply chain. And we have many companies that today have and survive and are successful thanks to a global supply chain. But how can you ensure that the supply chain works at the global level during a pandemic? But guys, let me be provocative and let me be honest. If trade today is under threat because of the COVID-19 virus, trade has been under threat before COVID-19 virus, because a lot of the dynamics of trade have changed, from a political perspective, but not only from that. And we could say that the entire global trade has changed because of how policy and politics have changed. The advent of, or the dream of China to become the global leader, the attempt of the United States to defend its leadership, and in a way also to establish better rules, or make sure that everybody respects the same rules. Europe has been definitely weakening, and here, we're talking from, and I'm talking from a European perspective, of course, but we can say that Europe is playing right now a minor role at the trade level, and it's very unsure where it's going to be positioned, close to the US, far from the US, close to China, next to Russia, close to the Middle East, and so on. But certainly rules have changed, and we live in a way, if we want to write a book today, probably should call it The Age of Confusion, because it's very unclear what is happening. And it's this is my dog that is complaining, of course, and unfortunately we have to stand my dog as well. But just to give you news today, there is a Chinese group of leaders that is visiting Norway, and Norway is not just oil. Norway is also a gate to the North Pole and to the Arctic. We also have tomorrow China visiting the Netherlands, and certainly Netherlands is one of the smallest country in Europe, but at the same time is one of the most active at the global level in terms of trade. So we have a very different scenario, and I'm very happy to discuss this today. Don't forget that our events are recorded, and they will be, of course, broadcasted online forever, and they will always be available online, and so everybody can access them, and we will make sure to distribute our video. And this is the beauty of the online discussion. We can have few people here in a small discussion, but then we will have hopefully millions of people out there in the global world. So let me start with Calum today, and thank you very much for joining us. And you have you're the correspondent of the Economic Standard. So what is happening at the global level with trade, Calum?
Hi, thanks, Pietro. Well, actually, what I was going to say, it really builds off what you've just been discussing, and I just really want to pull back and think about the broader context of what's going on with trade, or really how we're thinking about trade in this new world. So, obviously, when we look at the past 5 years, from our domestic politics in the age of social media, from the rise of neo-nationalism on the right and neo-puritanism now on the left, to the geopolitics of the rise of China and its increasingly bold foreign policy, to the worldwide socioeconomic effects we're seeing in this pandemic, one word that often comes up is apocalypse, in the sense of cataclysm, particularly with regard to the integrity of the post-Cold War order that has been globalized in the image of what was, for about 25 years, the world's only superpower, the US. And implied in a lot of the discussion we have, including, I think, possibly this discussion, is often a concern for forecasting how cataclysmic this period will be, what changes it will impose on, in this case, trade. My sense is that any attempt to forecast is almost pointless, because we are not really talking of a situation in which we are examining the effects upon a system from a change of a single variable, but rather the effects of a change in a system upon a single variable, in this case, trade. What I mean by this is that typically we forecast based on an assumption of continuity and stasis in general, and or on a change to a particular variable, like, for instance, the introduction of a new technology or a new law or a new event. But in this case, what we are attempting to forecast are the implications not of a change of a specific variable, but of a whole, or rather a change to the entire backdrop against which any such variable is meaningful and against which its significance is measured. And in the face of all of this societal flux, I'm not sure it can be anything more than wild conjecture for us to try to forecast the future of trade in the wake of, for instance, the pandemic, in any specific or quantitative sense. We can't really know the extent to which the pandemic, for instance, will have apocalyptic, in the sense of cataclysmic, implications for economies and trade in the long term. But we can perhaps talk of its apocalyptic effects in the original sense of the word. It's not widely known, I think, that while the modern meaning of apocalypse is cataclysm, the original meaning meant the revelation of what has previously been concealed. And what I mean by this is that what the last couple of years, I think, have done is throw into sharp relief things that were previously disguised, albeit in plain sight. By analogy, we can think of the political, geopolitical, and socioeconomic crises we're currently facing as akin to a prism. Not prism, P-R-I-S-M. If you have a beam of white light and you shine it at a prism, it will be refracted into its constituent colors. And I think if we take the white light here to be analogous to the rhythm of our previous normality before all these crises, a set of assumptions we had about the nature of the economic and trade system in a globalized, free trading and independent world, that's what I think we can take the white light to be in this analogy. And implied in so much of that system was an assumption of the end of history, in Francis Fukuyama's famous phrase, that the extra economic world, its politics, its cultures, its biosphere itself, be it in the form of pathogens now or the climate in general, the assumption that these were all a neutral sandbox within which economies and trade and economics in general could be rationally conducted on its own terms. But what we're seeing are that the terms are no longer its own, and that our economic and trading system is being threatened in both principle and in practice from things that are extra economic. I'll quickly address each principle and practice in turn. So first, we're seeing the exposure of the conditionality of the legal principles that frame and underpin the very idea of an international order, the comity among nations in which they each respect one another's legislative and judicial acts, which of course is the basis of a global system of free trade. And as everyone knows, China has long been engaged in systematic technology transfer and intellectual property theft, which is violating international law in the process. And in a future, and I think increasingly likely, no-deal Brexit scenario, the UK might well simply flout any legal agreements or obligations it has, exposing just how unenforceable international law is or treaties are, and how the power of the ideals of international law and treaties is actually inversely proportional to the realities of political and economic power of a nation state. If China's approach threatens the West system from without, I think the UK's actions potentially threaten it from within, The result could be a breakdown, I think, to the international system that we've only known, that's all we've really known for a few decades, arguably since the Second World War and certainly since the end of the Cold War. The second, so that's the threat to its principles. In terms of its threat to the practices of the global trade system that we have of free trade, what we're seeing is this exposure of the conditionality of its practices and international supply chains in particular, largely in the context of this pandemic, or more accurately, I think, in the face of the lockdown measures which have been taken to mitigate the spread of the pandemic. In the UK, there's been a supply chain shock from the lockdown measures, but this may well become a double shock if and when a no-deal Brexit scenario plays out. Again, what the imposition of these extra economic variables demonstrates is that the long-standing assumption that the world is a neutral sandbox within which markets can play out has perhaps always been something of a flattering delusion. That it existed for 2 decades, for the West at least, I think reflects not some achievement, but rather very good fortune of historical proportions. The very idea, I think, popular in modern macroeconomics, which as a rule of thumb tends to work from an assumption that the extra economic world is, to all intents and purposes, politically, culturally, and indeed biologically stable and neutral in any analysis, the very idea that we may forecast our economic futures seems to reflect, I think, less something about the objective nature of the world and more something about the subjective norms of the society that gave rise to the conceit that we can forecast. To take an analogy from physics, it reflects, I think, a classical or more Newtonian view of the world, where the flow of time, in our case, the flow of history, with its dilating and contracting politics and culture and fortunes, where the flow of time is neutral in its analysis. But I think the real world is perhaps better understood with a slightly more relative, or call it Einsteinian model, in which we realize that we can take nothing for granted, not even the passage of time, that the river of history and its vicissitudes of fortune cannot be overcome and cancelled out and corralled through some institutional formula, but rather continues, winding its own path inexorably and regardless of our attempts to direct it. And so just to conclude, all this matters because free trade is one of modern society's great achievements. But to maintain this system, I think we'll need to realize that the challenges we face are not actually historically exceptions or exceptional, but likely the rule being that extra economic circumstances are rarely neutral, as they've been for several decades. Rather, the era of post-Cold War frictionless trade was probably itself the historical exception. This being the case, the changes we need to make to maintain free trade require, I think, a change in how we understand macroeconomics, a shift to a macroeconomics based on a certain humility in the face of extra economic factors, rather than keeping it maintained on the basis of a hubris that says that those factors are hardly worth paying attention to. We've been, I think, very lucky for some decades, but the world is different now. We've returned from an exceptional period to the rule, and that rule is, I think, one in which the rules no longer apply. Thanks.
Thank you, Calum. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. And I appreciate, before moving to Patrick, 2 facts. First, you mentioned free trade. We mentioned free trade at 5:14, so 14 minutes after we started speaking. We should be a community of free traders, first of all. And that's a cultural problem, as you were talking about earlier. It's a cultural fact. The second, I liked your interpretation of this illusion, and that we're back to the rules. And probably, yes, I have to say I agree with you, and it takes some time to digest what you said, but it's very interesting. So I'm moving back to Patrick, and of course, asking whether you agree with Calum first. Are we back to the real rules, and we'll live in an exceptional time of free trade? And in order, to prolong this period or go back to this period, what do we have to do? And of course, you are also providing, and you're the only one right now based in the US, can you provide a US perspective to this? Because the idea of free trade is very, very much European in the beginning, but then it's represented by the US. But today we have to say that the US, in a way, are the first one challenging that type of free trade that Calum was referring to. Patrick.
Well, there's a lot to react to, so I can't possibly do that. I'm sort of keeping it at 60,000 feet, and I would just, sort of suggest that I'm kind of a simple guy who's first principles, right, and perhaps a bit more optimistic in terms of where this world is heading in terms of free trade. And when I was asked to spend 5 minutes, I was like, okay, I lead an organization. I founded an organization that supports the principle of free trade. I believe that government represents people, government negotiates free trade agreements, and I believe free trade is in the best interest of prosperity of all of our collective countries and sort of world economic growth and peace and all the reasons that we've adopted free trade as a culture. And so I was like, okay, well, why don't I make sure I understand what I think free trade means? And I went to Britannica, and free trade, they had a great definition for free trade. It said free trade, also called laissez-faire, right, is a policy by which a government does not discriminate against imports or interfere with exports by applying tariffs to imports or subsidies to exports. And I'm like, yep, I'm a free trader, right? Like if we can eliminate tariffs to imports and subsidies to exports, by and large, that has resulted in economic growth across all borders that is in the best interest of all citizens. And so, for me, from a United States perspective, and obviously I don't speak for the United States government, I speak for an association group that is interested in advancing the principles of free trade. I'm disappointed in the number of free trade agreements that the United States has negotiated, ratified, and is currently participating in, right? The United States of America, which I think continues to be the world's most important economy in terms of consumer-driven economy, has a responsibility to negotiate more free trade agreements, not fewer, because we currently have 14 free trade agreements that include 20 countries. So by and large, I'm an advocate for more free trade agreements, provided they sort of do their best to meet the definition of trade that I shared from Britannica, right? And I certainly support more bilateral investment treaties. And I think that the United States government is negotiating or continues to negotiate in an official or unofficial capacity trade agreements with China, Europe, and Britain. And I think that that's by and large a good thing, not a bad thing. In order to do that, I actually believe that the United States government should lead from in front, not behind, as it relates to free trade, right? And so I think free trade agreements, and I'm sure my friend at the Global Intellectual Property Center will have some stuff to say about this, but free trade agreements are the best way to agree on foundational value-based principles about how economies are going to do business and commerce together, right? And so Calum, where he pointed us to, I think importantly, is the idea that free trade agreements should sort of create global standards around things like intellectual property, against things like forced technology transfer, protection against what we call in our country crony capitalism, and in other countries they talk about state-owned enterprises, right, on the subsidy side of these free trade agreements. And I don't think anything can do more to advance the interest of citizens, no matter what government represents them, than sort of foundational agreement around those principles. And that at the end of the day, if we can have foundational agreement around those principles, that I believe the United States and China can negotiate bilateral or multilateral trade agreements that are in the best interest of American consumers, right? American companies, Chinese consumers, Chinese companies, and investment capital, right? In a way that allows us to create more opportunities, not fewer. Now, where I think Calum's dead on is fear index, right? Around sort of real things, practical things like job creation, like innovation and protection of intellectual property, that the more fear there is, and I think COVID primarily drives fear, right? The bigger impact you're going to have on an economy, the bigger impact you're going to have on jobs, and the bigger impact that those things are going to have around protectionism and trade. But I would urge our policymakers to reject sort of knee-jerk reactionism, because at the end of the day, the only solution to better government and to better economies is trade and commerce. It's the only thing that's ever worked. It's the only thing that will work in the future. Now, I think the United States needs to be doing a better job at leading this effort, right? Because if I want to set intellectual property property protection standards globally through trade agreements, right? I should do a better job at home protecting intellectual property. You know, if I oppose forced technology transfer, you know, the big story today is TikTok and a forced sale of TikTok to Microsoft in the name of, you know, security. Now, I would see if I was a Chinese person or if I was a Chinese leader, how that could be defined rhetorically or in reality as forced technology transfer, right? And then, you know, we can't be the beacon against subsidies, you know, when we're opposing phosphate imports or threatening to put tariffs on phosphate imports that put taxes on our farmers, right? Or as it relates to subsidies around products and services, we can't be importing, you know, subsidized drug prices to European baskets of socialized medicine programs. And so at the end of the day, if you're going to lead from the front, you need to be consistent with your first principles. And I think we can do a better job of that. Now, you know, Larry Kudlow and Lighthizer and the president and his team negotiating trade agreements that reduce subsidies, right, and reduce tariffs. By and large, that's a good thing. And I hope they get a good deal, not just for American consumers and the American economy and American innovators, but they get a good deal for global economies, global workers, and global innovators. And I believe that with the United States Chamber of Commerce and all kinds of other people, you know, this administration or the next administration, that the best days are ahead for international trade, because the only solution for economic growth is commerce, and the only way to responsibly do commerce is through trade. So for whatever that's worth, that's my perspective, and grateful for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you so much, Patrick, and particularly thank you so much also for offering what you define as a more optimistic approach. But of course, you're based in the US, so if people in the US are not optimistic and you are pessimistic like us in Europe, and more pessimistic, because Calum said clearly there are 2 points. One is trade after pandemic, and the other one is Brexit, and that's another issue that we have to challenge in the coming years, at least here on the European side of the Atlantic. There's a bunch of points I'd like to come back, but I have to move fast here because the Austrians give us, you know, a very strict time. So I'm moving to the more institutional, and allow me to say that side of the conversation, and therefore to Robert and to Dan. Here we have 2 different approaches, and allow me also to say that Patrick is more political, Calum offer more analytical, and I would also say, don't get offended, and more philosophical also interpretation of what's happening. And I appreciate both very much. But if we are right now in this sort of situation in between what we had in the past and what is ahead, and Patrick is right, trade is the solution, but you know, US have to lead and somebody has to establish the rules. And it seems that right now it's hard to understand who is establishing the rules. And so it's going to be a long process. But how can we solve this, Robert and Dan? And I start with Robert. First of all, how can we set rules? Because when we talk about free trade, and going back to your definition, that of course is that, let's say, the usual definition, we forget to mention the rules. There's always rules when we have 2 parts engaged and involved. First of all is that. And the second, if we don't have, or if trade is under threat, or if we are rethinking the way of doing trade, how do we deal with supply chains or global supply chains? Because one case that amazed me during the China-US war is Apple. Apple is still there, still making business with China, is probably very much answering what the Chinese government wants, and in a way caring less about what Trump says. When you mentioned TikTok, now it's revealing probably the gossip that the Facebook CEO Zuckerberg asked President Trump basically buy TikTok and take it away from the Chinese hands. But there are also other cases. I think about the food supply chain. During the pandemic, we still got food thanks to a global supply chain that kept working. But imagine, I was thinking, you know, in my pessimistic European approach, what if the food supply chain during the pandemic, because of a less free trade world will collapse. We won't get food on our tables. You know, people that love to have the orchard next to their homes will be happy, but you know, the billion of people around the world will not be able to eat Nutella, and you know, that's going to be a big of an issue. So Robert, I start with you. It was a very long question, more than a comment, and then we move to Dan.
Tremendous. Well, look, thank you very much, Lorenzo. It's great to be on another one of these panels with our friends from the Free Market Roadshow, hosted by your good self, Lorenzo. So thank you very much. A very, very short introduction. I work for the Global Innovation Policy Center, which champions trade, certainly, but also innovation ecosystems, strong IP rights, and so on around the world. And we're part of the US Chamber of Commerce, the largest business federation in the world. Look, I mean, so many fascinating things have already been said. I'm not going to engage philosophically or politically because that's not what my role is today, as much as I would like to. But just allow me just a few seconds of response. So, I mean, just in terms of Calum's treatise, I think that you know, excellent stuff. From an institutional perspective, I think what we might see is that there is a rebalancing going on around the world, and arguably, you know, COVID has led to the repositioning and the re-emergence of the primacy of the nation state, which maybe never went away in the first place. We just sort of imagined that maybe it was less important, and that, you know, maybe the nation states were a thing of the past. You know, but then now, because of China and the re-emergence of a very large Chinese economy that is obviously state controlled and so on, a United States that has been recalibrating politically under this administration to a certain extent. Things like Brexit are arguably another symptom of this sort of certain reaction to globalization, and the fact that we have had this tremendous amount of economic success over the past few decades, and political stability, largely the product of excellent stewardship by multiple European and US administrations over the years, which helped create the multilateral order and the basis for extending the rule of law and free markets and free trade around the world. So, you know, arguably this has been just an enormous success. It's very, very hard to challenge that, but too often I fear it's the sort of thing that is taken for granted, and you know, we can somewhat complacently in the wealthy West. We're always looking for what next, how can we improve our circumstances, but you know, the rise of Asia, and I'm not just talking about China, but the rise of Asia economically is a testament, in part, yes, to maybe a little more state ownership and more control over the means of production than outside China than we are used to in Europe and the US. But for the most part, it's the extension of free markets and the kinds of practices that began with the Industrial Revolution, UK, Europe, you know, the Dutch, the great trading nations, and continued through the extraordinary leadership of the United States over the past few decades. And the creation of the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and so on and so forth was a hugely important part of that. So yeah, there's some challenges. Does that mean that we're living in a post-rules regime, Calum? Probably not. You know, trade agreements continue. Yeah, the WTO is in a really tough spot, in large part because we all hoped that when the Chinese joined, they were going to adapt their practices. They didn't. They did ever so slightly, but for the most part, have been hugely successful using their own system that, of course, most of us sort of will observe for the economic successes, but also have huge amounts of concern about both from some of the political angles, of course, but also as Patrick has mentioned, state-owned enterprises, the record of Chinese companies, perhaps in some respects, has not been as we would wish, and there's been a top-down planning, made in China, is a hugely important part of that, where the Chinese government are enormously focused on building the innovative industries of the future, but not in a traditional free market IP rule of law based way, their own way. So this, of course, has put everything out of whack, and is a huge challenge, which is in part one of the reasons why this current US administration has looked to recalibrate trade. It doesn't necessarily mean that this administration is anti-trade. I certainly don't speak for this administration, and the US Chamber is vehemently opposed to the use of tariffs in principle. But what we've mainly seen, I think, is a phase one trade deal between the US and China that is pro-trade, that is anti-discrimination against US and other foreign companies trying to do business in China. And the whole point of trade deals ultimately is discussions and negotiations between states to ensure that there is fairness, non-discrimination for me in one other country and my business and so on and so forth. It's most favored nation type agreements, and we want to try and remove friction, remove barriers. To get to Lorenzo's two questions, how do we set rules? Well, I think as you said, Patrick, we particularly things like IP, trade remains a hugely important way to try and spread the importance of property rights and other important rights for inventors and creators. The fact that we're on the cusp of seeing some extraordinary treatments and vaccines that will actually be a real lasting solution to COVID, is testament to the huge amounts of investment and the types of policies that governments, particularly in the US, but also in Europe, have had for a number of years. And companies are building on a lot of their previous work, years and decades of work and experience, and it's only because of repurposing and reusing a lot of the R&D that has gone in previously that we're able to get so close so soon. I mean, it's truly remarkable, and the enormous investments and resources that the various commercial entities have put into this has really been awe-inspiring, and I don't think we should lose track of that. So yeah, how do we set rules? Well, we cleave to the existing kind of rules that we've had in the past, and that means, yes, holding certain other states to those rules. It does mean working cooperatively with like-minded nations. We do need a much better coordination and cooperation between the US, European member states, and say Japan and others to make sure that there is fairness in the world trading system that doesn't currently exist. That's why we need reform to the WTO. That's why we need to continue to work on these important trade agreements. Not just involving China, but sure, US UK I think is going to be a great opportunity. These are two free market, free trading nations with extraordinary history, shared history in many ways, of the rule of law. A real appreciation and valuation for the creative industries, for the healthcare sector, and there's a real opportunity to set a gold standard trade agreement here that hopefully then the UK can go ahead and use as a model for its future trading relationships with others. And there's a warning there to our friends in Europe. For many of us, it was a pity that the UK decided to go it alone. but you know, in some ways, the UK has an opportunity to sort of to raise its competitiveness and its ability to attract investment. And Europe really has a choice of does Europe want to remain competitive, or does it want to focus instead on things like data sovereignty? Does it want to focus on you know, let's make sure we can tax those big internet companies because at the moment they're paying tax principally to the United States, or does Europe actually want to be an attractive place to do business? That's the real challenge, I think, to Europe, and unfortunately, I don't think we're seeing this new commission seize that baton just yet. But fingers crossed, it's not too late. And actually, responding to COVID, recognizing the huge importance of IP-driven innovation that is going to get us out of this crisis, is a prerequisite, I think, to making sure that Europe once again becomes an attractive destination, a place to do business, rather than just a large group of consumers who are happy to consume the fruits of others' investment. So you said, Lorenzo, I think, you know, if trade's under threat, what about supply chains? I'm not going to talk at length about this. I do think this is somewhat overdone, the supply chain question. Unfortunately, at the beginning of the pandemic, a number of states, you know, harking back to what I was saying earlier about the primacy of nation states, a number of states, nation states, instinctively close up. They say we need to protect our people, we need to shut these things down, we need to control everything. Unfortunately, that was entirely the opposite of what needed to happen. Nations of threat that are used to importing and trading and dealing with companies whose supply chains span the entire globe need to keep working. And fortunately, we saw some export controls and other unfortunate tariff style measures melt away after a number of months, after it became clear that they were hindering rather than helping. But you know, things such as, you know, pharmaceutical supply chains, for some reason, some arguably well-meaning authors have been pushing the false but superficially appealing idea that, oh gosh, China controls everything, China creates everything, we're just consuming it, and that's a terrible situation. In reality, global businesses have extremely diverse supply chains, precisely to avoid circumstances where they're over-dependent. So before we start meddling and saying we need autarky and everyone needs to be self-sufficient, I think we need a proper and fact-based understanding of the current circumstances before we overreact and end up hurting ourselves. I think I've gone on for too long, so I'll.
Thank you, Robert, also for your institutional role. I'm not making any comment, but obviously you have offered an opportunity for dialogue at the international level, and in a way my question would be, yes, but are the counterparts ready to, you know, be engaged in this process? And then you mentioned also what Europe should do and what you expect from Europe, but really, in a way, you open the Pandora box when it comes to some of the problems that Europe has. Then when we talk about the web tax, I have a different approach to that. We'll come back to that probably another time. Let me move quickly to Dan, otherwise we run out of time. Dan, you have in a way a privileged position because you're in Brussels, but you run UK Chamber of Commerce. So what is, taking the first three talks here, what is your view? Also, do you agree with what Robert said? And are you more optimistic, or you have some pessimistic approach to it?
I'm more optimistic, to be honest. I mean, I think there's no doubt we've gone through a rocky patch for trade, and we're going to continue to go through that for a while. But overall, I think the outlook for trade is actually still relatively positive. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, first of all, what we've seen with COVID was the culmination of what we've already been seeing for a number of years. I mean, effectively nativist political discussions going on in the big trading member states, the US particularly, the UK, France, Italy, Germany. You've seen this around around a lot of the world, and of course the challenge with China, where I think we maybe missed an opportunity with China when they joined the WTO. You know, they then at that stage were agreeing to sign up to the Western system, the Western rule system, at least for international trade. And I think, as Robert sort of alluded to, we hoped that that would start the change in China. Now, realistically, looking back on that, China have used that access for geopolitical reasons effectively to build themselves up as a separate bloc. And now we're going to have to face the challenge of how to deal with that. And I suspect in the medium term, that probably means, particularly in the tech sphere, that you won't necessarily have a global trading system in the same way that you did. It'll get split up a little bit. I think also, you know, from my perspective, the US talks a very good game on free trade, but, you know, I was involved in the negotiations originally on TTIP when I was in the European Parliament. And, you know, if you look deeply at a lot of the American trading system, I mean, it's as deeply protectionist as the EU is. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Most of the big Western countries like free trade for exports, but they don't particularly like free trade for imports. I mean, US is a good example. Germany is a classic example of that within the EU single market, but you also look at Japan, which exports a lot but doesn't import very much. And I think this is one of the challenges. So part of this challenges of trade is actually you know, it's a challenge within the West of winning the hearts and mind explanation of why free trade benefits everyone. And because of this nativist political sort of debate we're having a little bit at the moment, trade gets caught up in that. But I strongly believe that this is a cycle that's probably culminated from the 2008 financial crisis, where, particularly in the UK, where there was a really big crisis in terms of per capita GDP loss. And we're hopefully, once we get through this economic crisis that we'll see with COVID, be able to re-engage within the West and the sort of principles of why free trade has lifted billions out of poverty in the last 20 years, and we'll do that even more if we back it. I think Brexit as well, if I can just say something right now on Brexit, because interesting sort of comments I've heard prior to that. Now, I was not in favour of Brexit, I was a Remainer. But I was very close to many of the initial advocates for Brexit because they were all free traders, or they all see themselves as classical liberals, because they believe very much, certainly the intellectual seed for Brexit, which was within the Conservative Party in the UK, was that the EU holds back the UK from free trade. That was their sort of starting point. And I went on the other side because I think there's a free trade classical liberal argument for the EU. If you look at the single market and the fact that you have a single market built on things like mutual recognition of standards. Now that's a holy grail in trade deals. And it only happens in the EU because you have an arbiter, which is the European Commission that manages these disputes, makes itself unpopular in doing it. But without that, you're not going to have mutual recognition of standards. And as a result of that, you're going to have less free trade. So I believe there was a classical liberal argument for staying in the EU. But I was amongst the classical liberal community in the UK, I was more or less out on my own on that one. Most of the others had the view that Brexit would strengthen not just UK trade, but the global trading system. And I think, you know, that the UK re-engaging in its own right in trade forums is going to be a good thing for rhetoric around trade going forward. You know, the UK is desperate to get trade deals with all of the major economies around the world. They're negotiating with the US, they're negotiating with Japan, they're negotiating across the board. And they will want to get trade deals, even if those trade deals don't immediately give a huge amount of economic benefit. It sends the message that the UK is open for business in this side and wants to sort of really develop that in the future. And I think the UK can also play a strong role in wherever the WTO goes, if we can get the WTO on track. And the EU also, in terms of trade, is actually pretty good. I mean, in the last couple of years, they've just recently signed a trade deal with Japan, you know, which is a huge trade deal. They've been active around quite a lot of the rest of the world with trade deals over the last few years. The Canadian deal has just been signed. They've just modernized the trade deal with Mexico. They've got a trade deal with Vietnam that's just been agreed. So, you know, the EU is activist on trade deals. The UK is going to be activist on trade deals. Even if you look at some of what appears to be anti-trade rhetoric from the US administration. Actually, this to me looks a lot about trying to just use a new tactic to break down some trade barriers that the US experiences when they're trading with other countries. So actually, I think we should be a bit more positive about where trade is going, because long-term, the outlook is still good and we've got history on our side. Where I also think the big change in trade is that no one's mentioned yet, but that is technology. And just give you a basic example. During the lockdown, when my kid's school was closed, my son did coding courses from a school in California that offered these courses to anyone. So he did a coding course. He learned coding. He didn't need to go to his local school down the road to do coding anymore. And providing that those qualifications can be recognized going forward, just look at the craziness that we're going to see in the next 10, 20 years when technology really gets going. Actually, you don't necessarily need these government barriers that exist at the moment, because we can buy services, digital services, particularly anywhere in the world. I mean, look, everyone more or less now has got a Zoom account around the world. They're all engaging in international trade by getting those accounts. And I think the international trading system is not actually geared up for where we're going to go on this. And if you take this really, really down the line, when we get into the stage that people could theoretically print their own goods in their houses, and international trade rules at the moment are focused on very much about trading goods, where does that leave us? We're going to need a new trading system to deal with that. But the trade is going to go on before the system and the rules and the global sort of trading environment catches up with it. So I think overall, we should be relatively positive about where trade is going, and the fact that people are going to trade when there is a need. Businesses, and we're seeing this in the British chamber, even with the uncertainty over Brexit that's coming up, businesses and consumers and people, they still want to trade, and governments can either facilitate that to make it harder, to make it better, or they can put in some barriers and restrictions to make it harder. But that basic will in a interconnected, tech-focused world in the future is not going to go away. So I'd be pretty confident about that going forward.
Thank you so much, Dan. The question I would have for you, but then I move to Calum, and I'll take a quick round of comments by all of you, and then we get to the hour and we close. The Austrians wants me to close at 45, but let's say it's summer, we take extra time because it's a very interesting conversation, and I'm sure I enjoyed your talks here. But when you said about technology running first and running fast and first, and then rules coming afterwards, don't you think that is exactly what has caused this negativism and this pessimism around trade? Because trade and globalization moved very fast, and the legal system actually was not able to catch up. Many of the things that are happening with data protection, for instance, in the European Parliament, and the risk is that we will have a service industry globalized, but then we don't have rules to guarantee the fair access of everybody to that trade market. And that's my fear. That's we kind of forget some people. You remember President Trump talk about the forgotten, those people that were forgot out of the globalization process, out of free trade. So that's something we want to take into consideration. But Calum, coming back to you, are you define yourself as pessimistic here? Are you still, and please maintain your role because we need somebody to be pessimistic here, but are you still pessimistic, and are you still in a way, I know you want to clarify your position here, but are you convinced that we need to work to go back to a stronger free trade?
Well, if I have to play the role of the villain who says I'm pessimistic, I'm happy to play it. But I'm actually, the truth is, I mean, I don't mean to spoil the binary here, but I'm not really pessimistic or even really optimistic. My point's really that I don't know, in the sense that I don't think we can really forecast because there's too many variables at play. My point is simply that these sorts of disruptions we're seeing, these sort of extra economic disruptions, be they acts of man, the political ones, or acts of God, the pandemic, in either case, I think that they are more likely to become the rule than the exception. And my argument is simply that for a few decades, they have perhaps been less pronounced than they have been prior to the last few decades. And I think going forward, And I think if we are more careful in our analyses to presume that they're going to be there going forward, we'll be less surprised when they happen, and frankly more delighted when they're not. So that's really my argument. So I wouldn't really, my point is, it's not really about pessimism or optimism. It's about assuming complexity and things we do not know, or presuming that we are masters of the universe. That's really the distinction I would work with.
No, and I appreciate very much also your reference to physics and to Einstein earlier. And that's the complexity we're living in, and it makes hard to forecast. And as we know, one of the biggest challenge for companies is actually being able to forecast, understanding what will happen. And next, and with COVID, unfortunately, and we were discussing prior to this seminar before going live, it was the big question is what's happening next week when people are going back to work. Patrick, are you convinced by Calum? Do you think his approach is genuine?
Well, I should say that I use the word optimism to discuss my view. I don't think I called Calum
No, I know.
But at any rate, no, I mean, a couple of things that I heard that that I definitely agree with is that the U.S.-UK trade agreement allows us to sort of, have a open public dialogue about how countries who share values, and if we could do this with Europe as well, how countries that share values can create a gold standard in trade agreements. And I'm very practical in my approach here. I view COVID or protectionism around battleground states or any of these other things as events. You know what I mean? I don't view them as trends. So, my sense is, and I agree with Dan, that, the administration may be using, in my opinion, they're using the stick, right, to sort of get countries to agree on foundational values around trade. And at the end of the day, whether it's this administration or a next administration, that's going to continue to be the U.S. Position, because I think Dan nailed it, which is, people want to do commerce, right? Like people want to do commerce. I'm sitting here in my house looking at a 3D printer. I've got all kinds of stuff on my laptop. That what happens is people move commerce, government and law reacts, and that it has never been anything but an advancement forward in the foundational values of commerce and trade. And I don't believe in Armageddon theories. I believe that people want to be free, people want to do commerce, and that at the end of the day, that is a slow march of inevitability, and that's good for the long-term, focus, the long-term view of trade, in my humble opinion. So grateful for the opportunity to be here, man. Bunch of smart people. So I loved everything I heard, including Calum.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you. But I'm afraid that with the 3D printer, you're going to kill trade because you're going to make everything on your own. That's a joke, of course.
I don't have
but Robert
talent or time.
Robert and Dan. Now, going back to being serious, you guys have been serious. I'm trying to be more of a joker, but here the challenge basically is the gain on governments. Okay, and I would really, I took some notes. I have many questions I'd like to ask, and you have a role to help governments, or in a way, a job to lobby governments to go into the direction of trade. But you said clearly, the first problem is not China. The problem is also within our administration. The problem is in Europe, as Robert said. So first, we need to fix our internal problems. And obviously, and this is not the topic of today, but there is also a problem, going back to what Calum said correctly earlier, there is a problem with capitalism as well, if we want to look at this. There is a problem with a lot of the dynamics of how we have been running business in the past, or in the past years. And the second issue is, how do we deal? You mentioned Asia in general, and I agree with you, because Asia is more than China, but the player is China. And just to come to you guys, last week 2 weeks ago, I got a call from a partner in China who has invited me to a conference. And of course, first they asked me to send a video of my speech to kind of monitor what I say in the video. So I will take part to this event, but my speech will be recorded. And that's pretty funny. But the word they used, they said, we want to celebrate free trade, they told me. And, we want to understand what's happening in the West considering protectionist policies by President Trump. And obviously that's propaganda, but China is great in spreading propaganda. And, you know, the more you repeat the message, as Nazi Germans were used to say, the more you convince people. So I'm afraid that also some Europeans and some people in the Middle East, they get used to the idea that US are no longer the leaders in free trade and China is the leader. Robert, I come to you and then we close with Dan.
Thank you very much, Brenda. Yeah, and I mean, this is, Pietro, forgive me. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should minimize the challenge of China. Obviously, it's hugely important politically and economically, and we certainly the US and China need to have a political and economic relationship. I think what was alluded to there was. It's almost as though the suggestion is the US is the basis of protectionism. But what we're really talking about when we're talking about trade is reciprocity and non-discrimination. And ultimately, what we haven't seen, but maybe we are beginning to see because of the Phase 1 trade agreement between the US and China, is a recognition by the Chinese government that there is no reciprocity for US and European companies. It's not the same treatment that they get, that the Chinese counterparts get when they try and do business in China. That said, when Chinese businesses, and you know there are some exceptions that we can point to, do business in Europe and the United States and elsewhere in Asia, they are treated, for the most part, just the same as their counterparts from those countries. That's what free trade is. It's non-discrimination, and it's holding foreign entities, commercial entities, and treating them in exactly the same way that you treat your own business. That's why we have trade rules, for the most part. That's why, you know, there's comparative advantage and all the stuff from economic textbooks that most of us have long since forgotten. So yeah, we shouldn't minimize China. You know, and I think it'd be unfair to characterize the European approach as all pessimistic and, you know, it's just all dreadful regulation that's very bad. There's definitely a risk of doing that too, particularly from afar. You know, Europe has very many competitive advantages, so does the US, and it just makes sense for Europe to build on those, arguably, and for you know, big supporters of European countries. You know, I want Europe to succeed. You know, US and other businesses want to do business and invest in Europe. So we just need to try and make sure that European governments recognize those benefits and that they seek to improve the system to build opportunity to generate further competitiveness and make sure that Europe is a good place to start a business, build a business, invest in a business, and hire lots of Europeans. You know, it shouldn't be that difficult. And there we go. Do you have a second question, Pietro? I don't know if that
No,
answered.
I had to stop Robert. Apologize because we're running out of time and I already got a message here. Dan, I want to conclude with you, and please.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I think all of this, we are now living in a geopolitical world, which is one that we haven't lived in for 30 years. And maybe I think that's sort of what Calum's also alluding to from the man-made impact. We are in a geopolitical world, and if we want trade to succeed, trade's got to also work within that geopolitical world. And I think both China and the US have been using trade as a geopolitical tool. There's no doubt about it. And I think, you know, maybe to end on a positive note, how we can advance free trade and the whole principle of this in the future is we really need to make a trade pillar of the transatlantic alliance, because at the moment we have a defense pillar and a security pillar, which is a strong, you know, NATO is as strong as you could get anywhere in the world, but yet we don't have a trade part of it. So you know, we will protect each other's, you know, we will protect each other from dying, but we won't sell each other chicken. Now, there's something wrong with that. So to me, the real focus and what we can do now, I honestly think, is we're going to have a bit of a rupture with China because there's a geopolitical challenge there. But the US, China and the US almost have a symbiotic relationship here on trade, as we all know. You know, China does rely on those Western markets and will continue to. We rely on getting those cheap goods from China to stop, you know, significant cost of living challenges that we have. So we need to recognize that, but at the same time, we should use trade as a geopolitical tool and build this transatlantic alliance, which now in a post-Brexit age means a US-EU trade deal and a UK-EU deal and an EU-US deal. And I think if we can get that tied in and we tie the West together closer, that's actually will be a huge part of ensuring that the West can deal geopolitically with any challenges that do come from China or Russia in the future.
Thank you, Dan, so much, and I couldn't agree more, considering that free trade and trade are the foundation of the open society, and here we try to promote the open society. So I want to thank the Austrian Economics Center for allowing us to run this, and particularly Martin and Barbara that I saw was online earlier, Brit and Victoria, and also my team at Competere. I have to say we achieved two great results. First of all, on the today is the 27th of August. We were able to be here. First, great results. And some Italians were here too. Second, it's probably the first panel in the world with 4 English mother tongue, or at least 1 American, 3 British, beautiful British mother tongue, managed and led by an Italian. So that's a great result. So thank you so much for being so patient with my accent and my limited, certainly, a number of words. But thank you so much. I think we learn a lot. We share a lot. We learn a lot. And I think our knowledge remains in our database online, and the event is being recorded so everybody can access it, and we'll make sure that it will be accessible to everybody that wants to discuss free trade. Just to let you know, I'm also sharing this with my students in Philadelphia as we're talking very much about trade, and sometimes they sound confused. And Patrick, that's a challenge for you. Young generation are a bit confused about what trade is and how it works. So please help me in providing them the tools, not in really educating them by providing the tools, not the truth. So thank you very much, Calum, for your talk and your interpretation of free trade and what's happening right now. Thank you, Robert, again. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Patrick, very much. And hopefully I'll see you very soon in person somewhere, maybe in Brussels, Washington, or wherever you are, guys, right now. And you're very welcome, of course, to meet me in Brussels or our teams in Italy. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, and see you very soon.